The deafening roar of industrial machinery shattered the morning silence in the gleaming Sterling and Associates corporate complex, nestled in the heart of Manhattan's financial district. Between corridors lined with Italian marble that cost more than most people's homes, the humble figure of James moved like a ghost in his faded company uniform. At 35, James possessed three qualities that made him both invaluable and invisible: an extraordinary ability to understand any piece of equipment simply by observing it work, a crippling shyness amplified by mild Asperger's syndrome that made him avoid complex social interactions, and an unwavering loyalty to those he deemed worthy of his trust. His internal conflict ran deeper than the Hudson River. His neurological condition made him technically brilliant but socially vulnerable, constantly torn between desperately wanting recognition for his talents and his inability to navigate the treacherous waters of human relationships. Having grown up an orphan at St. Mary's Children's Home in Queens, James never fully developed the skills to recognize emotional manipulation, especially from people who exploited his genuine need for acceptance and human connection. The other children had families to teach them about love and betrayal. James only had broken toys to fix and discarded appliances that spoke to him in ways people never could. On this particular morning, as expensive suits hurried past him without acknowledgement, the central air conditioning system, a German-engineered marvel worth $500,000, decided to breathe its last breath. The timing couldn't have been worse. In Conference Room A on the 15th floor, Patricia Sterling was hosting the most important meeting of her 6-month tenure as CEO. Japanese investors with $15 million and zero tolerance for discomfort. 3 specialized technicians, each charging $1,000 per hour, stood around the massive unit like surgeons around a dying patient. Their expensive diagnostic equipment beeped and hummed, but the machine remained stubbornly silent. The building's temperature began to climb, and with it the anxiety of everyone inside. Patricia Sterling, 42 and still learning to fill her father's imposing shadow, watched from her office window as chaos quietly unfolded below. She had inherited more than just a company when her father suffered his unexpected heart attack 6 months ago. She had inherited 3 generations of immigrant dreams, built brick by brick from nothing into something magnificent. But inheriting legacy and knowing how to preserve it were entirely different challenges. Unlike her father, who ruled from his ivory tower, Patricia had recently begun walking the floors, desperate to understand every heartbeat of the operation that now rested on her shoulders. It was during these walks that she first noticed him, the quiet janitor who somehow made broken things work again, with nothing but patience and intuition that seemed almost mystical. 40 miles away in Brooklyn, Ashley Martinez clocked in for another day at the upscale dermatology clinic where she had worked as a receptionist for 3 years. But her meticulously maintained smile and perfect attendance record masked a truth that would have terrified her co-workers. Ashley was a predator, and James was her carefully selected prey. Ashley had been recruited by a sophisticated criminal network that specialized in long-term financial fraud against wealthy families. Her mission was surgical in its precision: infiltrate the Sterling Circle, identify vulnerabilities, and create access points to Patricia Sterling's fortune. James had been profiled as the perfect access target, a talented but socially isolated employee who could be manipulated into becoming an unwitting accomplice. For 3 years, Ashley had studied James like a scientist studying a lab rat. She knew exactly which compliments made his eyes light up, which criticisms crushed his spirit, and most importantly, how his desperate hunger for love made him blind to her true nature. What Ashley hadn't anticipated was that Patricia Sterling would develop a personal interest in James, forcing her to rapidly adapt her carefully laid plans. The first domino fell when James, during his routine morning inspection, heard the distinctive whine of the failing air conditioning compressor. His self-taught expertise, earned through years of repairing discarded electronics in the neighborhood where he grew up, immediately identified the problem: a pressure imbalance in the cooling system that any competent technician should have spotted within minutes. But James had learned long ago that his opinions carried no weight in the gleaming corporate tower. He was invisible labor, as interchangeable as the light bulbs he replaced. So he said nothing, watching in silence as highly paid experts scratched their heads and muttered about replacement costs. In the sweltering boardroom 15 floors above, Patricia fought to maintain her composure as the Japanese delegation shifted uncomfortably in their $1,000 suits. The smell of overheating electronics began to drift through the ventilation system, and beads of perspiration appeared on foreheads that should never have known such indignity. Mr. Tanaka, the lead investor, politely excused himself to make a phone call. Patricia knew that call would determine whether Sterling and Associates secured the contract that would define her legacy or lost it, along with the respect she was still fighting to earn. Meanwhile, Ashley's phone buzzed with a text from James during her lunch break. "Can't meet today. Emergency at work." "Rain check?" Her response was swift and calculated. "Seriously? You're choosing your pathetic job over me again? I'm embarrassed to tell my friends what my boyfriend does for work. Maybe I should find someone who actually has ambition." Each word was a needle, precisely inserted where she knew it would hurt most. James read the message in the supply closet where he kept his tools, his hands trembling slightly as the familiar shame washed over him. He had been saving money from his modest salary to buy Ashley a ring, convinced that marriage would prove his commitment and worth. Her words made him question everything about himself, just as she intended. By 3 o'clock, the building had become unbearable. The marble floors were slick with condensation, executives had abandoned their jackets, and the Japanese investors were openly discussing their departure. The 3 technicians finally admitted defeat. The entire system would need to be replaced, a process that would take 2 weeks and cost over $1 million. Patricia felt the weight of generational responsibility crushing down on her shoulders. This building wasn't just a workplace. It was her grandfather's dream made manifest, her father's life's work, and now her burden to carry. The potential loss of the Japanese contract wouldn't just hurt financially. It would shatter the reputation that 3 generations had died building. In his small apartment in Queens that evening, James sat on his second-hand couch, staring at Ashley's latest text. "My friend Jessica is dating a lawyer who just bought her a Mercedes. What am I supposed to tell her when she asks what you got me this week?" The cruelty was breathtaking in its precision. Ashley knew James rode the subway to work, knew his paycheck barely covered rent and groceries, knew that every dollar he saved for her came at the cost of something he needed for himself. But she also knew that her disappointment was his greatest fear, and she wielded that knowledge like a surgeon's scalpel. James closed his eyes and thought about the air conditioning system. In his mind, he could see exactly what was wrong. A simple calibration issue that required understanding, not expensive replacement. He could fix it in 30 minutes with tools that cost less than 1 hour of the specialist's time. But who would listen to a janitor? The next morning brought desperation, thick as summer humidity. Patricia had spent the night researching alternative solutions, calling every HVAC company in the tri-state area, even considering the impossible expense of temporary industrial cooling units. Nothing would work quickly enough to save the Japanese contract. At 7 a.m., she stood before the broken machine like a general surveying a lost battlefield. The technicians were returning with replacement parts worth more than most people's annual salaries, ready to begin the slow process of rebuilding what should have been repairable. James arrived early, as he always did, carrying his battered toolbox and the weight of a sleepless night. He had made a decision that terrified him more than Ashley's anger. He was going to speak up. Not because he expected to be heard, but because watching something fixable die felt like watching himself die a little more each day. As the technicians unpacked their equipment, James approached the senior specialist with hands that shook slightly from nerves and 3 cups of coffee. "Excuse me, sir, I think the problem might be in the pressure calibration, not the compressor itself." The technician looked at James's uniform, then at his face and laughed. "Look, pal, I've been working on German systems for 15 years. I think I know a dead compressor when I see one." His dismissal was casual, automatic, the kind of professional arrogance that comes from never having been wrong about anything that mattered. But Patricia, who had been watching from the mezzanine level, caught something in James's voice. Not the uncertainty of guessing, but the quiet confidence of knowing. She made a decision that would change everything. She walked down to the basement level, her Italian heels clicking against marble floors like a countdown timer. "What did you say about the pressure calibration?" she asked James directly, ignoring the startled looks from the technicians who had never seen the CEO in the building's bowels. James felt his mouth go dry. Patricia Sterling was standing 3 feet away from him, asking for his opinion like it mattered, like he mattered. "Ma'am, it sounds like the pressure sensors are out of sync. If you listen carefully, you can hear the compressor trying to compensate, but it's fighting itself." The senior technician scoffed. "Mrs. Sterling, I appreciate that you want to be thorough, but this man is a janitor. He doesn't understand industrial-grade German engineering. These systems require specialized knowledge and certification that takes years to develop." Patricia studied James's face, seeing something there that reminded her of her father, the quiet confidence of someone who truly understood their craft. "Show me," she said simply. What happened next would be talked about in the Sterling and Associates break room for years to come. James, with hands steadier than they had any right to be, opened his toolbox and withdrew a small pressure gauge that looked like it belonged in a museum compared to the technicians' gleaming equipment. He attached it to a port that the specialists had overlooked, and the reading immediately confirmed what his ears had told him. "The pressure differential is 0.7 psi off specification," he said quietly. "The compressor thinks there's a leak, so it's working overtime, trying to compensate. But there's no leak. The sensors just need recalibration." The silence that followed was pregnant with possibility and humiliation in equal measure. The senior technician grabbed the gauge, checked the reading twice, then attached his own equipment to verify. His face went through several color changes as he realized that the janitor had diagnosed in minutes what his team had missed for 2 days. James made a small adjustment to the pressure sensor, and the air conditioning system rumbled back to life with a sound like mechanical satisfaction. Cool air began flowing through the vents immediately, and the building's oppressive heat started to dissipate like a bad dream. Patricia felt something shift inside her chest. Not just relief at the crisis being resolved, but something deeper and more personal. This man had just saved her company, her reputation, and her family's legacy with nothing but knowledge earned through poverty and determination. While expensive consultants had failed, true expertise had emerged from the most unexpected place. The Japanese investors felt the temperature change within minutes and returned to the conference room with restored good humor. The contract was signed that afternoon, with Mr. Tanaka commenting that any company that could solve problems so efficiently was clearly well managed and worthy of investment. But for James, the real transformation began when Patricia approached him privately later that day. "That was remarkable," she said, and her voice carried genuine admiration, not condescension. "How did you know?" James felt heat rise in his cheeks, but for once it wasn't from shame. "I've been fixing things since I was little, Mom. When you grow up with broken stuff, you learn to listen to what machines are trying to tell you." Patricia made a decision that would ripple through both their lives. "Would you be interested in a promotion? We need someone in our facilities management team who actually understands how things work, not just how they're supposed to work." For the first time in years, James smiled without calculating whether he deserved to. "I'd like that very much, ma'am." That evening, James rushed home to his small apartment, his heart lighter than it had been in months. He had finally proven his worth, finally been seen and valued for who he truly was. His first instinct was to share the joy with Ashley, to finally have good news that might make her proud of him. But when he called her, bubbling with excitement about his promotion and the recognition he had received, Ashley's response cut through his happiness like a blade through silk. "About time you did something useful. Maybe now you can afford to take me somewhere decent for dinner instead of those gross places with fluorescent lighting." The joy leaked out of James like air from a punctured tire. Even his moment of triumph was somehow inadequate, somehow not enough to earn basic kindness from the woman he loved. As he hung up the phone, James didn't realize that Patricia Sterling had been watching him make that call from her office window, and her heart had broken a little for the man who had saved her company but couldn't seem to save himself from someone who clearly didn't deserve him. The stage was set for a collision between authenticity and manipulation, between someone who saw James's true worth and someone who saw him only as a means to an end. The machine was fixed, but the real repair work was just beginning. 2 weeks after the air conditioning triumph, James found himself in a position he never imagined possible, sitting in an actual office chair, in an actual office, with his name printed on an actual nameplate that read, "James Wilson, Facilities Specialist." The irony wasn't lost on him that after years of being invisible, he now felt more exposed than ever. Patricia had kept her word with the efficiency that made Sterling and Associates legendary. James's salary had doubled overnight. His new position came with benefits he was still learning to understand, and most surprisingly, people now sought his opinion instead of dismissing it. But success, he was discovering, came with complications he hadn't anticipated. The morning started with another crisis, because Sterling and Associates seemed to attract mechanical disasters like honey-attracted flies. This time, the elevator system had developed an intermittent fault that was driving everyone crazy. People would press the button for the 10th floor and occasionally end up on the 15th. Press for the garage, and sometimes find themselves on the roof. The elevator company had sent their best technicians, but the problem persisted with the maddening inconsistency of a broken heart. James stood in the elevator shaft at 6 in the morning, having arrived early to study the problem in silence before the building filled with frustrated executives. His new position granted him access to areas he'd only dreamed of entering, but with access came responsibility that sometimes felt heavier than his old janitor cart. The control panel told him one story, but his ears told him another. There was a subtle whining sound in the motor that occurred only when specific combinations of buttons were pressed. After 30 minutes of careful observation, James realized the problem wasn't mechanical at all. It was in the software that controlled the elevator's logic system. Someone had installed an update that created conflicts in the programming, causing the elevator to misinterpret signals. As James worked to identify the exact source of the software glitch, his phone buzzed with a text from Ashley. "Dinner tonight at Luciano's, 8 p.m. Wear something decent for once." Luciano's was the kind of restaurant where appetizers cost more than James used to spend on groceries for a week. Ashley had been pushing for increasingly expensive dates since news of his promotion had spread through their social circle. Her sudden interest in being seen with him in public places felt different, more calculating, though James couldn't quite put his finger on why. The elevator problem turned out to be more complex than anticipated. The software patch that was causing the issues couldn't simply be removed. It was integrated with safety systems that required the glitches to be fixed line by line. James spent the morning deep in code that most people would have found incomprehensible, but to him it read like a story written in logic and mathematics. By noon, he had isolated the problem and developed a solution that would not only fix the current issues, but improve the elevator system's overall efficiency. As he prepared to implement the fixes, Patricia appeared beside him, her presence announced by the soft click of expensive heels on marble floors. Another mechanical mystery, she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. James felt the familiar heat of nervousness, but it was different now, less about fear of dismissal and more about not wanting to disappoint someone who had shown faith in him. Software issue this time. Someone tried to update the security protocols without checking compatibility with the navigation systems. Patricia watched as James's fingers moved across the diagnostic keyboard with the precision of a concert pianist. There was something almost artistic about how he worked, each movement deliberate and purposeful. She found herself genuinely curious about the mind that could see patterns where others saw only chaos. "How long have you been interested in technology?" she asked, settling against the wall as if she had all the time in the world to hear his answer. The question caught James off guard. In his old position, personal conversations with management were forbidden territory. Now, Patricia Sterling was asking about his interests like they were equals, like his thoughts mattered beyond their utility to the company. "Since I was little," James said, his hands never pausing in their work. "At St. Mary's, the kids would break their toys and I'd fix them. Made me feel useful. When I got older, people started bringing me their broken appliances. Never charged them, they didn't have money anyway. But I learned something new from every machine." Patricia felt something twist in her chest at the casual way James mentioned growing up in the children's home. His entire childhood had been other people's broken things and donated kindness, yet he spoke without self-pity or resentment. If anything, there was gratitude in his voice for the opportunities that hardship had provided. "My father used to say that the best leaders understand every part of their operation," Patricia said softly. "I'm starting to think he was wrong. The best leaders recognize true expertise wherever they find it, even when it comes in unexpected packages." James paused in his typing, looking up at Patricia with surprise. The compliment was genuine, not the patronizing praise he'd grown accustomed to from Ashley when she wanted something. This felt like recognition of his actual worth, not manipulation of his insecurities. The elevator system hummed back to perfect operation with a satisfied mechanical sigh. James ran a series of test calls to ensure everything functioned properly, and each elevator responded with flawless precision. What should have taken professional programmers days to diagnose and fix, James had resolved in a single morning. "Remarkable," Patricia murmured, genuinely impressed. She had inherited a company full of people with impressive degrees and expensive suits, but James possessed something far rarer, the ability to solve problems that others couldn't even properly identify. As the afternoon wore on, word of James's latest success spread through the building with the speed of good gossip. Unlike his air conditioning repair, which had been witnessed by only a few people, the elevator fix affected everyone in the building. By 5 o'clock, James had received more thank you messages and genuine smiles than he'd accumulated in his entire previous year. But the success felt hollow as 8 o'clock approached and his dinner with Ashley loomed ahead like a dental appointment. He had hoped that his promotion might change the dynamic between them, that proving his worth professionally might somehow translate to earning her respect personally. Instead, Ashley seemed more demanding than ever, as if his increased salary was simply a higher target for her expectations. James arrived at Luciano's 15 minutes early, wearing his one good suit that he'd bought second-hand and had tailored to fit properly. The restaurant's interior was all soft lighting and expensive whispers, the kind of place where conversations were conducted in hushed tones and every plate looked like art. Ashley arrived 20 minutes late, making an entrance that drew appreciative glances from other diners. She had always been beautiful, but tonight she seemed to glow with a confidence that felt aggressive rather than attractive. Her dress was new, something James was certain she couldn't afford on her receptionist's salary, and her jewelry caught the candlelight like tiny stars. "Sorry I'm late," she said without sounding sorry at all. "I was talking to Jessica about her wedding plans. Did you know her fiancé is buying her a house in the Hamptons? A whole house, James, for someone he's known for 8 months. The comparison was subtle but venomous, delivered with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. James felt the familiar knot of inadequacy forming in his stomach, the sense that no matter what he achieved, it would never be enough to satisfy Ashley's ever-expanding expectations. Throughout dinner, Ashley peppered the conversation with similar comparisons. Her friend Sarah's boyfriend had just bought her a car. Her cousin Maria was dating a doctor who took her to Paris for the weekend. Each story was carefully chosen to highlight what James couldn't provide, what their relationship lacked compared to everyone else's seemingly perfect romance. "I saw an apartment listing today," Ashley said over dessert, her voice carefully casual. 2 bedrooms in Manhattan, beautiful kitchen, doorman building, only $4,000 a month. "We could afford it now that you're making real money." $4,000 was more than James's entire new monthly salary. Even if he spent nothing on food, transportation, or any personal needs, he couldn't afford half that amount. But Ashley spoke as if money was simply a decision, as if his limitations were a choice rather than a mathematical reality. "Ashley, I don't make that kind of money," James said gently. "My promotion was significant, but it's not Wall Street money. We'd need to be more realistic about—" "Realistic?" Ashley's voice rose enough to draw glances from neighboring tables. "I'm 28 years old, James. My friends are getting married, buying houses, building lives. I can't keep explaining to people why my boyfriend thinks small while everyone else thinks big." The public humiliation was calculated and precise. Ashley knew that James's greatest fear was disappointing her, and she wielded that knowledge like a scalpel. Other diners tried not to stare as she systematically dismantled his confidence with surgical precision. "Maybe the problem isn't that I think small," James said quietly, finding reserves of dignity he didn't know he possessed. "Maybe the problem is that your expectations aren't based on who I actually am." The words surprised them both. James had never pushed back against Ashley's criticisms before, had always accepted her disappointment as justified and his limitations as character flaws. But something about Patricia's genuine respect for his abilities had shifted his perspective on what he deserved from the people who claimed to love him. Ashley's eyes flashed with something dangerous. "Don't you dare turn this around on me. I've been patient with you for 3 years, James. 3 years of making excuses for why we can't do things that normal couples do. I'm starting to think you don't actually want a future with me." The manipulation was masterful. By framing her unrealistic demands as normal expectations and his financial limitations as a lack of commitment, Ashley made James question his own reality. She knew exactly which buttons to push to make him doubt himself, to make him grateful for her continued presence in his life despite his obvious inadequacies. But tonight, something was different. Tonight, James had spent the day being valued for his mind, respected for his abilities, and treated as if his contributions mattered. The contrast between Patricia's genuine appreciation and Ashley's constant criticism was becoming impossible to ignore. "I want a future with you," James said carefully, "but I want it to be based on reality, not on fantasy. I'm good at what I do, Ashley. I'm making a real difference at work, solving problems that others can't solve. Isn't that worth something?" Ashley's laugh was sharp and cutting. "You fix things, James. You're a handyman with a fancy title. Do you really think that impresses anyone? Do you think that's enough to build a life on?" Each word was designed to wound, to reduce his accomplishments to their most basic components, and strip away any dignity or pride he might have gained. James felt the familiar spiral beginning, the voice in his head that whispered she was right, that he was fooling himself, that a man from nowhere had no business dreaming of somewhere. But then he remembered the look in Patricia's eyes when the elevator system hummed back to life. He remembered the genuine gratitude from colleagues who could finally get to their floors without confusion. He remembered the pride he'd felt in solving problems that defeated expensive specialists with impressive credentials. "You know what, Ashley?" James said, standing up from the table with a calmness that surprised them both. "You're right about one thing. I do fix things. I fix things that matter, things that make people's lives better. And maybe it's time I started fixing my own life too." He placed $60 on the table, enough to cover his portion of the meal, and walked away from the most expensive restaurant he'd ever entered, leaving behind not just Ashley's shocked expression, but 3 years of accepting treatment he never deserved. Outside Luciano's, James walked through the Manhattan evening with something he hadn't felt in years: self-respect. His phone buzzed with increasingly frantic texts from Ashley, but for the first time he didn't rush to check them. He didn't need to know what new manipulation or emotional blackmail awaited him. He was discovering that the same intuition that helped him understand broken machines could also help him recognize a broken relationship. The subway ride back to Queens felt different tonight. Instead of replaying Ashley's criticisms and planning how to do better, James found himself thinking about the look of genuine admiration on Patricia's face when he'd explained the elevator fix. He thought about colleagues who now sought his expertise instead of dismissing his presence. He thought about the apartment he could actually afford, the life he could actually build, the person he was becoming instead of the person Ashley demanded he be. By the time James reached his modest apartment, he had made a decision that would change everything. He was going to stop trying to be enough for someone who had decided he would never be enough, and start being enough for himself. The broken elevator had been fixed. Now it was time to fix the broken parts of his own life. His phone showed 17 missed calls from Ashley. James turned it off without listening to a single voicemail. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new problems to solve, new opportunities to prove his worth to people who actually valued it. Tonight, for the first time in 3 years, James Wilson went to sleep feeling proud of who he was instead of ashamed of who he wasn't. In her penthouse apartment, Patricia Sterling stood at her floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the city lights and thinking about the quiet man who saw solutions where others saw only problems. She didn't know that across the city, that same man was finally learning to value himself the way she had instinctively valued him from the moment he'd fixed what couldn't be fixed. The stage was set for two people to discover that sometimes the most meaningful connections happen when someone stops trying to be worthy of the wrong person and starts becoming worthy of the right one. James woke to the sound of his apartment buzzer screaming like an angry electronic bird. The digital clock glowed 6:47 a.m. in accusatory red numbers, and through his bedroom window the Queen's morning was still painted in shades of grey and possibility. The buzzer continued its assault, followed by the thunder of someone pounding on his apartment door with the desperation of a person fleeing fire. "James, I know you're in there! Open this door right now!" Ashley's voice carried through the thin walls with the fury of 3 years of careful manipulation suddenly threatened. James lay in bed for a moment, staring at the ceiling and listening to the woman who had controlled his emotions for so long, now reduced to screaming in a hallway like a child having a tantrum. The pounding intensified, accompanied by increasingly shrill demands. "James Wilson, you open this door, or I'm calling the police. You can't just walk out on me. We need to talk about this like adults." The irony of Ashley demanding adult conversation while throwing a public fit wasn't lost on James. He rose slowly, pulled on a robe, and approached the door with the same methodical patience he used to diagnose complex machinery. Through the peephole, Ashley looked like a hurricane made human, her makeup smeared from crying or rage, her hair disheveled, her expensive dress wrinkled from what had obviously been a sleepless night. When James opened the door, Ashley pushed past him into the apartment with the entitlement of someone who had never been refused anything she truly wanted. Her eyes were wild, scanning the small space as if looking for evidence of betrayal or competition. "You embarrassed me," she spat, spinning to face him with trembling hands. "Do you have any idea what it was like, sitting alone at Luciano's while people stared at me? The humiliation. Jessica texted me at midnight, asking if we broke up because her friend Sarah saw me crying in the restaurant bathroom. James closed the door quietly, studying Ashley's face with new clarity. Her distress wasn't about love or loss. It was about image, about the story she told the world about herself. He had become a prop in her performance, and props weren't supposed to walk off stage without permission. "I paid for my portion of dinner," James said calmly. "I didn't abandon you. I left a situation that was making me unhappy." "Making you unhappy?" Ashley's laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. "You think you get to be unhappy? James, look around. Look at this place. You live like a college student while I'm trying to build a real life for us." She gestured at his modest apartment with dramatic disgust. The second-hand furniture he'd carefully maintained, the small kitchen where he'd learned to cook because eating out was a luxury, the books stacked on shelves made from boards and concrete blocks because he couldn't afford real furniture. "I've been patient with you," Ashley continued, her voice climbing toward hysteria. 3 years, James. 3 years of waiting for you to grow up, to show some ambition, to prove that you're capable of being the man I need you to be. Each word was a familiar weapon, designed to make James question his worth and scramble to prove himself worthy of her continued presence. But this morning, instead of the usual shame and desperation to apologize, James felt something unexpected: clarity. "Ashley," he said quietly, "when have you ever been patient with me? When have you ever encouraged anything I've accomplished? Yesterday I solved a problem that stumped professional engineers, and your response was to tell me I'm just a handyman with a fancy title." Ashley's eyes flashed with dangerous anger. She wasn't accustomed to James questioning her narrative or defending himself. Her manipulation tactics worked best when he accepted her version of reality without resistance. "That's because you needed to hear the truth," she screamed. "Everyone else coddles you, tells you you're special, makes you think you matter more than you do. I'm the only one who loves you enough to be honest about your limitations." The twisted logic was breathtaking. Ashley had reframed years of emotional abuse as love, criticism as honesty, and manipulation as tough love. James recognized the pattern now. She tore him down not to help him improve, but to keep him dependent on her validation. "If that's love, Ashley, then I don't want it anymore." The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. Ashley went completely still, her face cycling through disbelief, rage, and finally settling on something cold and calculating. "You don't mean that," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow felt more threatening than her screaming. "You can't mean that. James, I'm the best thing that ever happened to you. Before me, you were nobody. A janitor living in this dump, invisible to everyone. I made you matter." James felt the familiar pull of her words, the gravitational force of 3 years of conditioning that whispered she was right, that he was lucky to have her, that leaving her meant returning to invisibility and worthlessness. But then he remembered Patricia's genuine smile when he'd fixed the elevator, the respect in her voice when she'd asked about his background, the way she'd treated his expertise as valuable rather than surprising. "You didn't make me matter, Ashley. You made me think I didn't matter unless you said I did. There's a difference." Ashley's mask slipped completely, revealing something ugly beneath. "Fine. You want to play this game. You think you can do better than me. Let me tell you something about your precious new job, James. You're still just the help. You're still just a poor boy from an orphanage pretending to belong in a world that will never accept you." She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "That woman, your boss, you think she sees you as an equal? You think she respects you? She's probably laughing about you right now, telling her rich friends about the cute little janitor who thinks he's important because he can fix things." Each word was designed to destroy the confidence James had been building, to convince him that any respect or appreciation he'd received was either pity or amusement. Ashley knew exactly where his deepest insecurities lived, and she attacked them with surgical precision. "You're going to crawl back to me," she continued, circling him like a predator, "because deep down, you know I'm right. You know you don't deserve better than what I give you. And when you do come back, and you will, I might not be feeling so generous about taking you back." James stood in the center of his small living room, feeling the weight of Ashley's manipulation pressing down on him like water at the bottom of an ocean. For 3 years, these tactics had worked perfectly. Ashley would tear him down until he begged for forgiveness, then rebuild him just enough to keep him functional, but never enough to make him truly confident. But something had changed. Yesterday, James had experienced genuine respect and appreciation from someone who had no ulterior motive for giving it. Patricia Sterling gained nothing by making him feel valued. If anything, his success reflected well on her judgment. The contrast between Ashley's conditional, manipulative affection and Patricia's straightforward appreciation was impossible to ignore. "I think you should leave now," James said quietly. Ashley's confident facade cracked. She had expected him to break, to apologize, to beg her to stay and work things out. His calm dismissal was not part of any script she had prepared for. "You're making a huge mistake," she hissed. "You think that promotion makes you someone special? You think that rich woman actually cares about you? James, you're going to lose everything, and when you do, I won't be here to pick up the pieces." "I hope not," James replied, and his honesty was more devastating than any anger could have been. Ashley grabbed her purse and stalked toward the door, pausing for one final shot. "You'll regret this. When you're alone and miserable and that job doesn't work out because you don't actually belong in that world, you'll remember that I was the only person who ever really knew you." The door slammed behind her with enough force to rattle the cheap frames on James's walls. He stood in the sudden silence, waiting for the familiar panic to set in, the desperate urge to chase after her and apologize for imaginary sins. Instead, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: peace. James made coffee in his small kitchen, the same bitter instant coffee he'd been drinking for years, because real coffee was an unnecessary expense. But this morning, it tasted different. This morning, it tasted like freedom. His phone buzzed with a text message. For a moment, his old conditioning made him hope it was Ashley, calling to apologize, to take back her cruel words, to offer him another chance to prove himself worthy of her love. Instead, the message was from an unknown number. "Mr. Wilson, this is Patricia Sterling. I hope you don't mind me contacting you directly. There's been another situation at the building. The security system is malfunctioning and showing false alarms every few minutes. Would you be able to come in early today? I know it's Saturday, but I'd really appreciate your expertise. P.S." James stared at the message, rereading it several times. Patricia Sterling, one of the most powerful women in Manhattan, was personally asking for his help and apologizing for the inconvenience of weekend work. The contrast with Ashley's demands and ultimatums was so stark it almost made him laugh. He typed back, "Of course, Miss Sterling. I'll be there in an hour." The response came immediately. "Thank you so much, and please call me Patricia. See you soon." As James showered and dressed, he reflected on the morning's events. Ashley's visit had been a test, though not the kind she intended. Instead of proving her power over him, she had demonstrated how much he had changed. The man who walked out of Luciano's last night was not the same man who had spent 3 years accepting emotional abuse as love. The subway ride into Manhattan felt different on a Saturday morning. The usual crush of commuters was replaced by families heading to museums, couples on their way to brunch, tourists with cameras and guidebooks. James found himself actually looking at his fellow passengers instead of staring at his phone or the floor. When had he stopped noticing the world around him? Sterling and Associates on a Saturday was a different creature entirely. The usual corporate urgency was replaced by the peaceful quiet of a building at rest. James's footsteps echoed through marble corridors as he made his way to the security office, his toolbox feeling lighter than it had in years. He found Patricia in the security control room, surrounded by monitors, flashing red warning lights, and speakers chirping false alarms every 30 seconds. She was dressed casually in jeans and a sweater, looking more like a graduate student than a CEO, and she was clearly frustrated with technology that refused to behave. "James, thank God," she said when she saw him. "I've been here since 6 trying to figure this out. The security company wants to charge us $5,000 for an emergency weekend call, but I thought—" She paused, looking slightly embarrassed. "I thought maybe you could take a look first." James set down his toolbox and studied the control panel. The system was newer than anything he'd worked on, but electronics spoke a universal language that he'd been fluent in since childhood. Within minutes, he identified the problem. A sensor on the roof had been damaged by last night's storm and was sending contradictory signals to the main system. "I'll need to check the sensor physically," he explained to Patricia. "The computer can't tell the difference between an actual intrusion and a damaged sensor giving false readings." "Is it dangerous?" Patricia asked, genuine concern in her voice. James was touched by her worry. When had anyone besides him cared about his safety? "No more dangerous than changing a light bulb. Just need to climb up to the roof and take a look." 20 minutes later, James had located the problem. A tree branch had been blown against the sensor during the storm, creating an intermittent connection that triggered false alarms. He secured the sensor properly and tested the system, which immediately returned to normal operation. When he returned to the security office, Patricia was waiting with 2 cups of real coffee from what appeared to be an expensive coffee shop. "I thought you might like some proper coffee," she said, offering him one of the cups. "I noticed you drink instant coffee in the break room." The gesture was small but profound. Patricia Sterling had noticed what kind of coffee he drank, had cared enough to bring him something better, had thought about his preferences without being asked. James couldn't remember the last time Ashley had done something thoughtful without expecting something in return. "Thank you," James said, accepting the coffee. "That's very kind." They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the security monitors show normal green lights instead of frantic red warnings. James found himself stealing glances at Patricia, noticing things he'd been too intimidated to see before. The way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was thinking, the small scar on her hand that suggested she wasn't afraid of manual work, the genuine warmth in her eyes when she looked at him. "Can I ask you something personal?" Patricia said suddenly. James felt his chest tighten with familiar anxiety. "Of course." Yesterday when you were working on the elevator, you got a phone call that seemed to upset you. I don't mean to pry, but you looked hurt. Is everything okay?" The question caught James completely off guard. Patricia had noticed his emotional state, had cared enough to remember it, and was asking about his well-being, not as his employer, but as a human being who was concerned about another human being. "My girlfriend and I had a disagreement," James said carefully. Patricia nodded slowly. "The woman who was upset about dinner plans." James realized that Patricia had overheard more of Ashley's text messages than he'd thought. Heat rose in his cheeks, embarrassment at having his personal humiliation witnessed by someone he respected. "It's complicated," he said. "Complicated how?" Patricia asked gently. "If you don't mind me asking." James found himself wanting to answer honestly, wanting to share with someone who seemed genuinely interested in his life beyond his utility to them. "She has very high expectations about where we should live, what we should do, how much money we should spend. I'm not sure I can meet those expectations." Patricia was quiet for a long moment, studying James's face with the same attention she'd paid to an important contract. "James, can I tell you something my father used to say?" James nodded. "He said that the right person will love you not despite your limitations, but because of your strengths. The wrong person will focus on what you can't give them instead of appreciating what you can." The words hit James like a physical blow, not because they were harsh, but because they were true. Ashley had spent 3 years cataloguing his deficiencies while ignoring his strengths. She loved the idea of who he might become, not who he actually was. "My father also said," Patricia continued, "that a person's character is revealed not by how they treat their superiors, but by how they treat people who can't do anything for them." James thought about Ashley's treatment of waiters, cashiers, and customer service representatives, impatient, dismissive, often cruel. He thought about how she spoke to him when she wanted something versus when she was simply sharing her day. "Your girlfriend," Patricia said carefully, "does she treat everyone the way she treats you, or do you get special consideration?" The question was devastating in its simplicity. James realized that Ashley's cruelty wasn't reserved for him. It was her default mode, with anyone she perceived as beneath her status or unable to advance her agenda. "I ended things with her this morning," James said quietly. Patricia's face showed genuine surprise, then something that might have been approval. "How do you feel about that?" James considered the question seriously. How did he feel? Scared, certainly. Uncertain about the future. But underneath those expected emotions was something unexpected. Relief. "Free," he said finally. "I feel free." Patricia smiled, and James realized it was the first time he'd seen her truly smile. Not the professional expression she wore during business meetings, but something genuine and warm and beautiful. "Freedom can be terrifying," she said, "but it's also the only place where real happiness is possible." They sat together in the quiet security office, surrounded by monitors showing a building at peace, and James felt something shift inside his chest. For the first time in 3 years, he was sitting with someone who saw his worth without conditions, who appreciated his contributions without keeping score, who treated him like an equal worthy of respect and consideration. The foundation was being laid for something neither of them had expected when the morning began, the possibility that two people could find in each other exactly what they hadn't known they were looking for. 3 months had passed since James walked away from Ashley's manipulation, and Sterling and Associates had transformed into something resembling a mechanical symphony under his careful attention. Every elevator hummed with perfect precision. Every air conditioning unit maintained ideal temperature within half a degree, and the building's various systems worked together with the harmony of a Swiss watch. But this Monday morning brought a crisis that would test everything James had learned about his own worth. The main production machine, a German-engineered marvel that formed the heart of Sterling and Associates' manufacturing division, had suffered what 3 teams of specialists were calling catastrophic systemic failure. The machine, worth more than most people's houses, sat silent and cold, while executives calculated losses that grew larger with every passing hour. James stood before the massive machine at 7 in the morning, having arrived early to study the problem without an audience. The production floor stretched around him like a cathedral of industry, and the broken machine dominated the space like a fallen giant. According to the reports he'd read, the machine had simply stopped working 3 days ago, displaying error codes that made no sense to anyone who examined them. Patricia appeared beside him as he was running his hands along the machine's exterior, listening for sounds that shouldn't be there. She carried 2 cups of coffee and wore the expression of someone who had spent the weekend reviewing very bad news from very expensive consultants. "The specialists from Munich are flying in today," she said, handing him one of the cups. "They're estimating 2 weeks minimum for diagnosis, possibly a month for repairs. The parts alone could cost $500,000. James accepted the coffee gratefully, noting that Patricia had remembered he liked it black with 1 sugar. Such small considerations had become precious to him, evidence that someone cared enough to notice his preferences and remember them. "What does your gut tell you?" Patricia asked, watching as James continued his methodical examination of the machine. It was the kind of question that would have baffled his previous supervisors, who saw machines as collections of parts rather than systems with personalities. But Patricia had learned to trust James's intuition about mechanical problems, even when that intuition contradicted expert opinions. "It's not broken," James said finally, his voice carrying the quiet confidence that Patricia had come to associate with his most accurate assessments. "It's confused." "Confused," James pointed to a series of sensors along the machine's side. "These sensors are all talking to each other, but they're speaking different languages. Someone updated the software on this section without updating the corresponding programs on the other sections. The machine is trying to follow contradictory instructions, so it's shutting down to protect itself." Patricia felt the familiar flutter of hope that came whenever James made complex problems sound simple. "How long would it take you to fix that?" "If I'm right about the cause, maybe 6 hours. If I'm wrong." James paused, considering the implications of failure. "If I'm wrong, I could make it worse." The honesty was typical of James. He never overstated his abilities or made promises he couldn't keep. Patricia found his humility refreshing after years of dealing with consultants who promised miracles and delivered disasters. "The German specialists won't be here until Thursday," Patricia said. "That's 3 more days of lost production. What if I give you until Wednesday to try your approach?" James felt his chest tighten with the familiar anxiety of high stakes and higher expectations. But underneath the nervousness was something new. Excitement at the challenge and confidence in his abilities that hadn't existed 3 months ago. "I'll need access to the master control system," he said, "and I'll need to work without interruption. If people are constantly asking for progress reports, I won't be able to hear what the machine is trying to tell me." Patricia smiled at his unusual request. James worked best in silence, like a doctor listening to a patient's heartbeat. "Done. I'll make sure you have complete privacy." As James began his examination in earnest, Patricia found herself studying him with the same attention she might give to a complex business problem. Over the past 3 months, she had watched him transform from a man who apologized for taking up space to someone who took pride in his expertise. The change was remarkable, like watching a flower bloom in time-lapse photography. There was something else, too. Something Patricia was only beginning to acknowledge to herself. She looked forward to their conversations about mechanical problems with an intensity that had nothing to do with business efficiency. James had a way of explaining complex systems that made her feel included rather than stupid, and his genuine excitement about solving problems was infectious. By noon, James had identified the core issue. The machine's various subsystems had been updated over the past year by different technicians, each working in isolation without considering how their changes would affect the overall operation. The result was a technological Tower of Babel, components that couldn't communicate effectively with each other. The solution was elegant in its simplicity. Instead of replacing expensive hardware, James could rewrite the communication protocols to create a common language between the different systems. It would require understanding not just how each component worked individually, but how they all worked together as a unified whole. As James worked deep in the machine's programming, his phone buzzed with a text message. For a moment, muscle memory made him tense. Months of conditioning had trained him to expect criticism or demands whenever his phone made noise. But the message wasn't from Ashley. It was from a number he didn't recognize. "James, this is Ashley. I got a new phone. We need to talk. I've been doing a lot of thinking and I realize I made some mistakes. Can we meet for coffee? I miss you." James stared at the message, feeling echoes of old emotions stir in his chest. Ashley's tone was different, softer, more vulnerable than the harsh ultimatums he remembered. For a moment he wondered if she had genuinely changed, if their breakup had prompted real self-reflection. But then he remembered Patricia's words about character being revealed through how people treat those who can't do anything for them. He remembered the way Ashley had spoken to restaurant servers, the contempt in her voice when she described his work, the calculated cruelty of her public humiliations. James deleted the message without responding and returned to his work. By evening, James had made significant progress. The machine's different subsystems were beginning to communicate properly, and several functions had already come back online. But the most complex integration would require another full day of work, and there was no guarantee that his approach would succeed completely. Patricia found him in the production floor at 8 o'clock, still bent over a diagnostic console with the focused intensity of a surgeon performing delicate surgery. She had ordered dinner from a nearby restaurant, nothing fancy, just good food that could be eaten while working. "You need to eat," she said, setting containers of food on a nearby workbench. "And you need to rest. The machine will still be here tomorrow." James looked up from his work, suddenly aware that his back ached and his eyes were strained from hours of close focus. "I'm close to a breakthrough. Just a few more hours, and I think I can get the main production line running again." "James," Patricia's voice carried gentle authority, "you're no good to anyone if you collapse from exhaustion. Take a break, eat something, clear your head." They sat together on makeshift seats made from equipment crates, eating Chinese food and talking about everything except the broken machine. Patricia told James about her father's struggles to build the company, about the immigrant work ethic that had driven 3 generations of success. James shared stories about growing up at St. Mary's, about the nuns who had encouraged his curiosity about how things worked. "Sister Catherine used to bring me broken appliances from the church," James said, smiling at the memory. "She said God had given me a gift for understanding his mechanical creations, and that gifts were meant to be used in service to others." Patricia felt something twist in her chest at the image of young James, finding purpose and validation in fixing things that others had given up on. "Do you still believe that? That fixing things is a form of service?" James considered the question seriously. "I think making things work better makes people's lives better, and making people's lives better feels like the right way to use whatever abilities I have." The simplicity and sincerity of his answer made Patricia realize something she had been avoiding acknowledging. She was falling in love with James Wilson. Not with his usefulness to the company, not with his problem-solving abilities, but with the man who saw service to others as the highest purpose for his gifts. "James," Patricia said carefully, "can I ask you something personal?" "Of course." "The woman who's been texting you, your ex-girlfriend, are you considering getting back together with her?" James looked surprised by the question. "No. Why would you think that?" "I noticed you seem tense whenever your phone buzzes. I thought maybe she was pressuring you to reconcile." James felt heat rise in his cheeks at the realization that Patricia had been observing him closely enough to notice his reactions to text messages. "She has been reaching out, but I'm not interested in going back to that relationship." "Can I ask why not?" Patricia's voice was carefully neutral, but James sensed genuine curiosity rather than idle nosiness. "Because I learned the difference between someone who loves you and someone who loves what you can do for them," James said quietly. "And I decided I'd rather be alone than be with someone who only values me when I'm useful to them." Patricia felt her heart accelerate at his words. Without thinking, she said, "You deserve someone who values you just for being who you are." "Do I?" James asked, and his vulnerability was heartbreaking. "Sometimes I wonder if being useful is the only thing that makes me worth knowing." Patricia turned to face him fully, her expression serious. "James, you're one of the most genuinely good people I've ever met. You solve problems because you care about making things better, not because you want credit or recognition. You treat everyone with respect regardless of their position. You're honest even when it would be easier to lie. Those qualities have nothing to do with your usefulness and everything to do with your character." James stared at her, absorbing words that felt like medicine for wounds he hadn't realized were still bleeding. When had anyone ever valued his character separate from his abilities? When had anyone ever seen him as worthwhile simply for being himself? "Patricia," he said softly, "can I tell you something?" "Anything." Working here, being trusted with important problems, having my expertise respected, it's changed how I see myself. But talking with you, having you see value in me beyond what I can fix, that's changed how I see what's possible for my life." The admission hung in the air between them, like a bridge neither had planned to build, but both desperately wanted to cross. Patricia felt the pull of attraction and affection, but also the weight of their professional relationship and the power dynamics that complicated everything. "We should finish this project first," she said finally, "before we figure out what else might be possible." James nodded, understanding her caution, but feeling hopeful rather than rejected. For the first time in his life, someone had seen him completely, his abilities, his limitations, his character, his potential, and found him worthy of consideration as more than just useful help. The next morning brought the ultimate test. James arrived at 6 a.m. to find Ashley waiting in the lobby, dressed in a way that strategically emphasized her best features while appearing vulnerable and approachable. She had clearly planned this ambush carefully, timing it for when he would be focused on work rather than personal drama. "James, please," she said as he approached. "Just 5 minutes. I know you're angry, but I need to explain some things. I need to apologize properly." James looked at the woman who had controlled his emotions for 3 years and felt nothing. No anger, no attraction, no desire to either hurt her or win her back. She had become irrelevant to his life, a character from a story he was no longer interested in reading. "Ashley, there's nothing to explain. We weren't good for each other. I hope you find what you're looking for, but it's not going to be with me." "But James, I've changed." Ashley's voice carried just the right note of desperate sincerity. "I realize how unfair I was, how I took you for granted. I want to make it right." James studied her performance with the same analytical attention he brought to mechanical problems. Every gesture was calculated, every expression designed to evoke specific emotional responses. She was still trying to manipulate him, just with different tools. "I need to get to work," James said simply, walking toward the elevators. Ashley's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the rage underneath her manufactured vulnerability. "You'll regret this. You think that rich woman actually cares about you? You're just her pet project, James. When she gets bored playing with you, you'll have nothing." The words were meant to plant seeds of doubt and insecurity, to make James question Patricia's motives and his own worth. But they had the opposite effect. They reminded James of exactly why he had left Ashley in the first place. As the elevator doors closed between them, James felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought him to this moment. He was about to attempt the most challenging repair of his career, working for a woman who valued him as both a professional and a person, free from the toxic influence of someone who had never seen him as anything more than a tool for her own advancement. The machine was waiting, and James Wilson was ready to prove that sometimes the most broken things could be made not just functional, but better than they had ever been before. The production machine hummed to life at 2:47 p.m. on Wednesday afternoon, its mechanical voice singing with the precision of a Swiss timepiece after James spent 36 hours learning its language. Every sensor communicated flawlessly with every other component, and the production line began manufacturing products with an efficiency that exceeded even the original German specifications. James stood before the massive machine, watching diagnostic screens display perfect green numbers, and felt something he had never experienced before, professional pride that no one could diminish. He had solved a problem that had stumped teams of specialists, not through expensive replacements or complex additions, but through patient understanding and elegant simplification. Patricia arrived in the production hall as the first completed products rolled off the line, their quality indicators showing performance levels that made her check the readings twice to be sure she wasn't imagining them. Behind her walked a parade of executives and department heads who had come to witness either triumph or disaster. "Ladies and gentlemen," Patricia announced to the gathered crowd, Mr. Wilson has not only restored our production capabilities, he has improved them beyond their original design specifications. The applause that followed felt surreal to James. Dozens of people in expensive suits were clapping for him, recognizing his achievement, treating him as someone whose success mattered. 3 months ago, these same people had walked past him without acknowledgement. Now, they were celebrating his expertise. But as the crowd dispersed and normal operations resumed, Patricia lingered beside the machine with an expression James couldn't quite read. There was satisfaction at the crisis being resolved, certainly, but also something else, anticipation mixed with nervous energy. "James," she said when they were alone, "I need to ask you something important." The seriousness in her voice made James's chest tighten. "Of course." Patricia walked to the main control panel and pointed at a diagnostic screen showing the machine's optimized performance. "This improvement you've made, it's not just fixing a problem. You've revolutionized how this system operates. Do you understand what that means for the company?" James shook his head, uncertain where the conversation was leading. "It means increased production efficiency by 30%. It means cost savings of approximately $2 million annually. It means competitive advantages that could transform our entire market position." Patricia turned to face him directly. "James, what you've accomplished here is worth more than most people make in a lifetime." The numbers were staggering, almost impossible for James to process. His modest fixes and improvements had generated millions in value. It seemed impossible that his simple understanding of mechanical systems could translate to such significant financial impact. "I want to offer you something," Patricia continued, her voice carrying a mixture of business authority and personal nervousness. "A choice that I hope you'll consider carefully." She paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "Option 1, I promote you to Director of Engineering Innovation, with a salary of $200,000 annually and equity participation in the company. You'll lead a team developing solutions like this one across all our operations." James felt his knees go weak. $200,000 was more money than he had imagined earning in his entire lifetime. It represented security, respect, the ability to help other people the way St. Mary's had helped him. "Option 2, Patricia said, and her voice dropped to something softer, more personal. "You accept the promotion, the salary, and the equity, and you let me take you to dinner at the nicest restaurant in Manhattan to celebrate. Not as your employer, but as someone who would very much like to know you better outside of these professional circumstances." The words hung in the air like a bridge between two worlds. The professional relationship they had built and the personal connection that had been growing beneath it. James stared at Patricia, trying to process not just the career opportunity, but the romantic interest she was expressing. "And option 3, Patricia added, with a smile that was equal parts confidence and vulnerability, "is that you tell me I'm being completely inappropriate, accept just the job offer, and we pretend I never said anything about dinner." James found himself laughing, not from nervousness, but from genuine joy at Patricia's honesty and the choices she was offering him. She wasn't pressuring him or manipulating him into a response. She was presenting clear options and trusting him to make the decision that felt right to him. "Patricia," he said carefully, "are you asking me on a date? I'm asking you to let me get to know the man who sees solutions where others see impossible problems. I'm asking you to consider whether the connection we've built over machinery and coffee might extend to other areas of life." Patricia's directness was refreshing after years of Ashley's indirect manipulations. "But I'm also asking you to think about it carefully, because I never want our professional relationship to complicate your personal life in ways that make you uncomfortable." James studied Patricia's face, seeing genuine care in her expression, not just for his professional success, but for his well-being as a complete person. She was offering him everything he had never dared dream of: meaningful work, financial security, respect, and the possibility of a relationship with someone who valued him for exactly who he was. "I need to tell you something first," James said, his honesty compelling him to share what might change her mind. "I've never been to a nice restaurant except once, and that ended badly. I don't know how to order wine or which fork to use for salad. I grew up in an orphanage, and I'm still learning how to navigate social situations that most people take for granted." Patricia's response was immediate and definitive. "James, I don't care about your table manners. I care about your character. I care about how you treat people, how you solve problems, how you find joy in making things work better. Everything else can be learned if you want to learn it, but who you are fundamentally, that's what matters to me." The acceptance was overwhelming. Patricia wasn't offering to fix him or change him or mold him into someone more suitable for her world. She was accepting him as he was, while supporting his growth into whoever he wanted to become. "Yes," James said simply. "Yes to which option?" "Yes to all of it. The job, the dinner, the chance to see what might be possible between us." James felt more courageous than he had ever felt in his life. "But I need to warn you. I have no idea how to be in a healthy relationship. The only serious relationship I've had was—" He paused, searching for words. "It wasn't healthy." Patricia stepped closer to him, her expression serious but warm. "Then we'll figure it out together. No pressure, no expectations beyond treating each other with respect and honesty. If it works, wonderful. If it doesn't, we'll always have solved some impressive mechanical problems together." As they shook hands to formalize the job offer and then hugged briefly to acknowledge the personal possibility they were exploring, James felt a completeness he had never experienced. For the first time in his life, he was being valued for his whole self by someone whose opinion mattered to him. That evening, as James prepared for his first dinner at Le Bernardin, a restaurant whose name he had to practice pronouncing, his phone rang with a call from an unknown number. Thinking it might be work-related, he answered without checking the caller ID. "James, thank God you picked up." Ashley's voice was breathless with apparent panic. "I'm in trouble. Real trouble. I need your help." The manipulation was immediately recognizable. The manufactured crisis designed to create urgency and bypass his rational decision-making. James had seen this script before, though never from a perspective of complete emotional detachment. "What kind of trouble, Ashley?" "I owe money to some very dangerous people. Gambling debts. They're threatening me, James. I'm scared." Her voice broke convincingly on the last word. "I need $50,000 by tomorrow, or they're going to hurt me." The amount was precisely calculated, large enough to seem like a genuine crisis, but small enough that James might consider it manageable with his new salary. Ashley had clearly researched his promotion and was crafting her emergency to match his perceived ability to help. "Have you called the police?" James asked calmly. "I can't. These people have connections. Going to the police would just make things worse." Ashley's voice shifted to desperate pleading. "James, you're the only person I can trust. I know things ended badly between us, but deep down, you know I love you. I wouldn't ask if I wasn't truly desperate." Every word was a familiar note in a song James had heard for 3 years. The false vulnerability, the manufactured crisis, the appeal to his protective instincts, the declaration of love, timed to maximize emotional impact. But instead of the usual anxiety and desire to rescue her, James felt only sad clarity about what Ashley truly was. "Ashley, I'm going to say this once, and then I'm going to hang up and block this number. I don't believe you're in danger. I don't believe you've changed. I don't believe you love me. I believe you've heard about my promotion, and you're trying to use our history to manipulate me into giving you money." The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds before Ashley's voice returned, now sharp with anger rather than soft with vulnerability. "You self-righteous bastard. You think you're so much better than me now? You think that rich bitch actually cares about you?" The mask had dropped completely, revealing the contempt that had always been beneath Ashley's performance. James felt grateful for the revelation. Any lingering doubts about his decision to leave her were definitively erased. "I think," James said quietly, "that I've learned the difference between someone who loves me and someone who loves what they think they can get from me. Goodbye, Ashley." He hung up and immediately blocked the number, then turned off his phone entirely. Tonight was about celebrating new possibilities, not relitigating old mistakes. Tonight was about becoming the man he had always been capable of being, finally free from the weight of someone else's emotional manipulation. At Le Bernardin, James sat across from Patricia at a table that overlooked Manhattan's glittering lights, wearing a suit that actually fit properly. Patricia had insisted on taking him shopping, claiming it was a business expense for her new director of engineering innovation. The restaurant was intimidating in its elegance, but Patricia's genuine excitement about sharing the experience with him made James feel welcomed rather than out of place. "I have a confession," Patricia said over appetizers that looked like small works of art. "I've been looking forward to this dinner for weeks, even before the machine crisis, even before the job offer. I kept finding excuses to seek your opinion on problems that I could have solved myself, just because I enjoyed our conversations." James felt heat rise in his cheeks, but it was the warmth of pleasure rather than embarrassment. "I thought I was imagining that you sought my advice more often than seemed strictly necessary. You weren't imagining it. And I think you should know, my interest in you has nothing to do with your usefulness to the company. You could have failed completely with that machine, and I still would have wanted to have dinner with you tonight." The declaration was everything James had never received from Ashley. Acceptance that wasn't conditional on performance, interest that wasn't transactional, affection that wasn't dependent on his ability to provide something in return. As they talked through multiple courses about everything from their childhoods to their dreams for the future, James realized he was experiencing something completely new, a conversation where both people were genuinely interested in learning about each other, where vulnerability was met with acceptance rather than exploitation, where differences in background created curiosity rather than judgment. "James," Patricia said over dessert, "I want you to know that whatever happens between us personally, your job is secure. Your professional success is based entirely on your abilities and contributions. I never want you to feel that your career depends on maintaining any particular relationship with me outside of work." The reassurance was exactly what James needed to hear. Patricia understood the power dynamics at play and was actively working to ensure his emotional and professional safety. She was thinking about his well-being, not just her own desires. "I've never felt as valued or as safe as I do right now," James said honestly. "Not just tonight, but over these past few months. You've helped me discover that I'm worth more than I thought I was." Patricia reached across the table and gently touched his hand. "James, you were always worth this much. You just needed someone to recognize it and help you see it yourself." As they left the restaurant and walked through Manhattan's evening energy, James felt the pieces of his life aligning in ways he had never imagined possible. He had meaningful work that utilized his abilities, financial security that would allow him to help others the way he had been helped, and the beginning of a relationship with someone who saw his true worth. When they reached Patricia's building, she turned to face him under the soft glow of the lobby lights. "James, I want you to know that tonight meant everything to me. Not because of the business success, not because of the promotion, but because I got to spend time with the man who sees beauty in broken things and finds ways to make them whole again." James felt his heart racing as Patricia stepped closer to him. "I've never felt as valued or as hopeful about the future as I do right now," he said softly. "You've helped me discover that I'm worth more than I ever believed possible." Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, and filled with the promise of something beautiful growing between two people who had found in each other exactly what they hadn't known they were searching for. When they separated, both were smiling with the quiet joy of a connection that felt both surprising and inevitable. "Tomorrow is going to be interesting," Patricia said with a laugh. "The new director of engineering innovation and the CEO officially dating. The corporate gossip mill is going to have a field day." James grinned, feeling more confident than he had ever felt in his life. "Let them talk. We know what this is really about. Two people who respect each other, building something real together." As James rode the subway back to Queens, he reflected on the evening's conversation with Ashley. Her desperation had been palpable, her manipulation tactics transparent, now that he understood what genuine care looked like. The contrast between Ashley's calculated cruelty and Patricia's authentic warmth was so stark, it almost seemed impossible that he had ever confused one for the other. His phone buzzed with a text from Patricia. "Thank you for an amazing evening. Sleep well, and I'll see you tomorrow, not as your boss asking for your expertise, but as someone who's genuinely excited to see you again. P.S. You looked incredibly handsome in that suit." James saved the message, then turned off his phone with a smile. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities, but tonight had proven that he was finally living the life he deserved, valued for his character, respected for his abilities, and loved for exactly who he was. The transformation was complete. From invisible janitor to valued professional, from manipulated victim to respected partner, from someone who fixed broken things for others to someone who had finally learned to fix what was broken in his own life. And most importantly, he had learned to recognize the difference between someone who used his kindness as a weakness and someone who celebrated it as a strength. In her apartment, 40 stories above the city, Patricia stood at her window, looking out at the lights of Manhattan, thinking about the quiet man who had revolutionized not just her company's operations, but her understanding of what authentic partnership could look like. For the first time in years, she was excited about building something meaningful with someone who valued her for who she was rather than what she could provide. But neither of them knew that across the city, Ashley was meeting with associates who specialized in more aggressive forms of manipulation and fraud. Her initial approach had failed, but she had invested too much time and effort in this operation to simply walk away. If James wouldn't return to her willingly, she would find other ways to access the sterling fortune, ways that would require him to cooperate whether he wanted to or not. The foundation for something beautiful had been laid between James and Patricia, but it would soon be tested by forces more dangerous and sophisticated than either of them had imagined possible.